So as I predicted a year ago, the overnight ratings for Jodie Whittaker's first story were amongst the highest since Doctor Who came back in 2005. Somehow, I don't think it will maintain this though. This video is intended to provide an honest review of The Woman Who Fell to Earth and highlight both the strengths and weaknesses of the episode. I also filmed a reaction video with a friend while watching the episode yesterday, and that should be up within the next week or two. I deliberately avoided any discussions of the episode on YouTube and Twitter yesterday so I could present my initial thoughts clearly and concisely in this video. First, we'll look at the positive points. Visually, the episode looked awesome, and the cinematography is perhaps the best we've seen in New Who. I also don't mind the new aspect ratio. It works very well with the new visual style. The effects also look more impressive than the previous era, which may be a result of being able to put more focus on each episode by reducing the total episode count to 10 rather than 13 and later 12, which was the standard in the past. Another strong point was the incidental music. While Murray Gold did some amazing stuff during the first 8 series of the show, his style felt old and worn out by series 9 and 10. Sort of like he was just going through the motions. Seguin Akinola's style is completely different from anything we've seen in New Who. In many ways, it harkens back to the radiophonic workshop. Rather than large, bombastic scores, his emphasis is on creating soundscapes. While Gold's score would often overpower the action on screen, Akinola's score melds into the background, with an emphasis on more obscure instrumentation, which gives the show an otherworldly feel. I was also glad that the god-awful pop music was reserved for the trailer. I also liked the performance of Bradley Walsh as Graham O'Brien and Tosin Cole as Ryan Sinclair. They both came across as genuine, and at least provided an emotional, if somewhat forced, grounding to the episode. Now let's take a look at the not-so-good aspects of the show. If there is one thing that Doctor Who should never be, especially when introducing a new Doctor, is dull. And well, my god, this episode was boring. Chris Chibnall wrote some decent episodes for Torchwood, but his Doctor Who episodes have been lackluster to say the least. 42, The Hungry Earth, Cold Blood, Dinosaurs on a Spaceship, and The Power of Three. These are not exactly highly regarded amongst Doctor Who fandom. This trend of mediocrity continues with The Woman Who Fell to Earth, which was a very average Monster of the Week story, which pales in comparison to the previous New Who stories that introduced new Doctors. Rose, The Christmas Invasion, and The 11th Hour are considered to be amongst the best that New Who has to offer, and Deep Breath gave us an absolutely mesmerizing performance from Peter Capaldi. Many people have complained of having trouble staying awake until the end of the episode, and I can see why. The Monster of the Week, Tazim Shah, or the Tooth Monster, is perhaps the most run-of-the-mill monster we've had in a very long time. It's like a checklist. What's this monster's quirk? Oh, he collects teeth. This is Shyamalan-type laziness. This episode really seemed to be trying to repeat the 11th Hour, but failed terribly. Now the big question. Jodie Whittaker is the Doctor. If you read the press, you'd think she gave one of the best performances in the history of television. Well, what I saw was someone desperately trying to play the Doctor, but not really pulling it off. A for effort, I guess. My appraisal of the 13th Doctor in the leaked clips and trailers remains the same after seeing the full episode. You can see her desperately trying to pull off a convincing interpretation of a quirky version of the Time Lord, but it comes off as utterly unconvincing because you can see her trying way too hard. More than anything, she seems to be trying to do an impersonation of Matt Smith, or basing her Doctor off Eleven's personality. And then, at the end, she tries to take on the colder aspects of David Tennant's Doctor's personality. The point is not to repeat Doctors that have come before, but to give us a new take on the character. Each new Doctor, going back to Troughton, has given us something completely different from previous Doctors. Until this one, that is. When we were first introduced to Eccleston, Tennant, Smith, and Capaldi, I was completely convinced by the end of the episode that they were the Doctor. Smith had been the one that I'd previously been most concerned about, and yet he blew me away in the 11th Hour. By the end of The Woman Who Fell to Earth, my concerns about Whittaker's performance pretty much seemed to be justified. You need to give us something new, not just a copy of your predecessors. I'm sorry, but I'm not convinced that you are the Doctor. What makes this over-exaggerated performance even worse is the drama that has been going on behind the scenes, which I have been covering on this channel for over a year now. Chibnall, if you're going to take on a risk as monumental as changing the gender of the Doctor, if you had the audacity to risk alienating half the fan base, then you needed to give us something much better than this. You made making this change a condition of your taking on the role of showrunner, and yet, it looks like you made the safe choice of picking an actress you had already worked with, after another actress you also worked with, who would have been perfect for the role, reportedly turned it down. You haven't given us an exciting incarnation of the Doctor. You have given us someone who merely seems to be doing an imitation of the Doctor without actually pulling it off. A cosplayer with a very big budget behind her. The northern accent also does not work for this Doctor. There have been 3 doctors who kept their own accents: Sylvester McCoy, Christopher Eccleston, and Peter Capaldi. But in each of those instances, it worked. It does not work here. While the Scottish accent worked for McCoy and Capaldi, David Tennant was self-aware enough to realize that it would not have worked for his Doctor. It was reported recently that Whittaker thought, quote, doing the Doctor in a different accent would have been tough. Jodie, you need to adopt whatever approach is best for the show, just as David Tennant did. The northern accent worked for Eccleston's more gritty Doctor, but it doesn't work for your Doctor. If you decided to keep your accent because you thought a traditional English accent would be too difficult, then maybe you should have reconsidered taking this role. I always thought that the ability to do different accents when a role requires it of you was one of the hallmarks of a good actor. You adjust yourself to the role when needed. You don't make the role adjust to you. Now let's talk about politics. It wasn't as in your face as many of us had feared in this episode anyway. But if you look at the trailer for the second episode, you can see the Doctor telling off an evil white male only a few seconds in. I think this is where the overt politics is probably really going to come into play. With that said, there was definitely politics in this episode, primarily as a result of what was going on behind the scenes with the show and the BBC. The BBC diversity and inclusion strategy was on full display in this episode, and it was clear that the production team was doing everything in its power to make sure that everyone knows that it was being used to its full extent. And oh, was it ever. Let's start with examining the city where the story takes place, Sheffield. Statistically, Sheffield is 84% white, a much larger proportion than, say, if the story had taken place in London. This is not the proportion that I saw in this episode. In fact, the majority of characters in the episode were non-white. For white males, we had Graham, that special kid, and maybe that guard. It's like the show was saying, look how diverse we are. Aren't we awesome? There's nothing wrong with diversity if it happens naturally. The problem is with forced diversity, and this is the BBC's mandate now. It's hard to take a character seriously if you know why they are there, and the reason did not take into account the story first. If this episode was supposed to take place in Sheffield, then more attention should have been given to the actual demographics of the city to provide for at least some degree of authenticity, rather than scoring wokeness points. And what was with the actor montage at the end? The only reason I could see for it was, once again, a proclamation of how woke and diverse you are. The whole thing just looked awkward, and was I the only one that noticed that the few white males all looked like they were degenerates or villains? Chibnall, you could have at least tried some subtlety here, because we all know why this was included. Let's also note that while I applaud Bradley Walsh's performance, his male character seemed to be portrayed as inherently weak. Just thought I'd bring that up. Another gripe. What happened to the opening title sequence? This has been a traditional staple of Doctor Who since 1963, and you can't just get rid of it because you're trying to make a statement about how different you are. We do get a theme at the end of the episode, and while it is better than the Capaldi cat being tortured by a theremin version, this one just sounded weak, especially when comparing it to, say, the Series 4 Tennant version, or either of the Smith versions. It just seems to have no punch to it. This was Akinola's only fail. Also, the TARDIS. Why did you make the decision to sideline it? This is perhaps the most quintessential thing that makes Doctor Who, Doctor Who. Considering you decided to make such a massive change to the show, one would figure that you would want things like the TARDIS around to help ground it, so people know that this is still Doctor Who. This seems to be trying to be different, just for the sake of being different, kind of like getting rid of the opening titles. So, in my final analysis, sorry, but this episode just doesn't cut it. While it has its positives, it's visually superior to what came before, the incidental music was first-rate, and Cole and Walsh gave great performances. This episode has too many problems considering what a paradigm shift this was supposed to be for the 55-year-old franchise. You have an actor that really isn't up to the task of playing the Doctor. You have a very run-of-the-mill and ultimately boring script, and you seem to have put the diversity and inclusion strategy before everything else. This doesn't change my mind about the 13th Doctor and this new era of Doctor Who one iota, but at least I have Akinola's score to look forward to. And that's it for today. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, and check out my other channel, Bulls Trek Media, for Blu-ray and technology videos. And as always, everyone, thank you for watching, and have a great day.